The morning sun shone across London as Daniel Carter hurried toward the headquarters of Sterling and Vale. At 36, Daniel was used to arriving early. He was a single father, and every morning required careful planning. His 8-year-old daughter, Emily, had already been dropped at school. Daniel had checked her lunch twice, fixed a loose strap on her school bag, and promised to pick her up after work. Now, he had one important meeting ahead of him. He was meeting the CEO, Victoria Sterling. Everyone at Sterling and Vale knew her name. She was young, extremely successful, and famous for making difficult decisions without hesitation. Daniel, however, had never been intimidated by titles. He respected people, but he believed respect had to go both ways. Daniel entered the company's enormous glass lobby. Employees moved quickly around him. Executives spoke on phones. Assistants carried folders. The building was already busy. Daniel adjusted his navy jacket and walked toward the private elevators. He wasn't wearing an expensive designer suit. His jacket had been tailored several years ago. His shoes were polished. His tie was simple, but he looked professional. At 9:30 sharp, Daniel entered the executive conference room. Victoria was already there. She sat at the end of the long glass table. Several senior executives surrounded her. Victoria looked up. "Mr. Carter." "Good morning, Miss Sterling." Daniel walked forward. He smiled politely and extended his hand. Victoria glanced at it. Then, without taking it, she turned back toward the documents in front of her. Daniel's smile disappeared. His hand slowly lowered. Nobody said anything. The silence was uncomfortable. Daniel simply took the empty chair. Victoria opened a folder. "We have a serious problem with the Carter and Bell partnership." Daniel nodded. "I know." Victoria looked at him. "You know, I reviewed the latest figures this morning." Richard Hale, the company's chief financial officer, laughed quietly. "You reviewed them this morning?" Daniel looked at him. "Yes." Richard leaned back. "And you found something our finance department missed?" Daniel opened his folder. "Several things." Victoria became interested. "How many?" 23. The room went silent. Victoria leaned forward. 23? Daniel nodded. "Incorrect delivery schedules, supplier pricing discrepancies, inventory reports, and one serious contractual problem." Richard frowned. "That doesn't sound possible." Daniel calmly placed several documents on the table. "It is..." Victoria picked up the first document. Daniel continued. "The proposed shipping schedule could create delays during the first quarter." Richard looked at the document. "How serious?" "Potentially millions of pounds." Victoria looked at Daniel. "How did you discover this?" "I compared the supplier reports with the warehouse records." "You did that personally?" "Yes." "Why?" Daniel paused. "Because nobody else had." That answer made Victoria look at him differently. Daniel wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply stating the truth. Victoria studied the documents. Then the conference room doors opened. Everyone turned. Eleanor Sterling walked inside. Victoria's mother, the founder of Sterling and Vale. Even though she no longer handled daily operations, everyone respected her. Eleanor looked around the room. Then she saw Daniel. Her expression changed immediately. "Daniel Carter?" Daniel stood. "Mrs. Sterling." Eleanor smiled. "I thought that was you." Victoria looked confused. "You know him?" Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Daniel's hand. Then she looked at Victoria. Her expression became serious. "Victoria." "Yes." Eleanor pointed toward Daniel. "Did you just refuse his handshake?" Victoria hesitated. "I..." Eleanor's voice remained calm. "Who insulted our biggest partner?" Nobody moved. Richard looked confused. "Biggest partner?" Eleanor walked toward the table. "Carter and Bell isn't just one of our clients." She looked directly at Victoria. "They are the company keeping our largest expansion project alive." Victoria nodded. "I know." Eleanor looked at Daniel. "Do you know what they told me yesterday?" Daniel shook his head. "No. They said they trust you more than they trust our entire operations department." Richard's face changed. Victoria stared at Daniel. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "I've only been doing my job." Eleanor smiled. That's exactly what makes this interesting. Victoria asked, why didn't I know about this? Eleanor looked at her daughter. Because Daniel never asked for recognition. Richard interrupted. Mrs. Sterling, with respect, he's an employee. Eleanor turned toward him. An employee who personally prevented a financial disaster. Richard said nothing. Eleanor continued. And an employee who was offered a senior executive position by Carter and Bell. Victoria's eyes widened. What? Daniel looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Sterling. She raised a hand. Let them know. Daniel sighed. 3 years ago, Carter and Bell offered me a position. How senior? Victoria asked. Daniel looked down. Very. Richard laughed nervously. And you refused? Daniel nodded. Yes. Victoria couldn't understand. Why? Daniel smiled slightly. Because I had a daughter who needed me. That answer silenced the room. Victoria stared at him. Daniel continued. I didn't want to travel constantly. I didn't want to miss school events. I didn't want Emily growing up thinking her father was always somewhere else. Eleanor's expression softened. That's why the Carter family respects him. Victoria looked at Daniel differently. For the first time, she understood that his simple clothes and quiet personality didn't mean he lacked ambition. He simply valued something different. His daughter. Eleanor turned toward Victoria. There's another reason I came here. Victoria looked at her. What is it? Eleanor placed a document on the table. Carter and Bell has changed the conditions of the partnership. Richard immediately reached for it. What conditions? Eleanor looked at Daniel. They want Daniel Carter personally involved in the entire 5-year transition. Victoria stared at Daniel. 5 years. Daniel nodded slowly. I didn't know that. Eleanor smiled. Because the offer was sent this morning. Daniel looked shocked. Victoria noticed. So you really didn't know? No. Eleanor nodded. That's exactly what I thought. Victoria picked up the document. Her eyes moved across the page. Then she stopped. Wait. Everyone looked at her. Victoria looked at Eleanor. They want Daniel to receive shares? Eleanor nodded. Yes. Richard stood. How many? Eleanor gave him a look. Enough to make him one of the largest individual stakeholders involved in the partnership. Richard stared at Daniel. Daniel looked almost embarrassed. I don't care about shares. Victoria couldn't help asking, why? Daniel looked at her. Because money can't replace time with my daughter. Victoria became quiet. She remembered how she had refused his handshake only minutes earlier. Now she felt embarrassed. She had judged him before knowing anything about him. Eleanor noticed her expression. Victoria. Yes. You should apologize. Victoria nodded. She turned toward Daniel. I'm sorry. Daniel smiled. Thank you. Victoria extended her hand. This time, Daniel didn't hesitate. They shook hands. But something unexpected happened. The moment their hands separated, Daniel's phone rang. He checked the screen. His expression changed. Victoria noticed. Is Emily okay? Daniel answered immediately. Hello. He listened. His face became serious. Then he looked at Victoria. I need to leave. Victoria stood. What's wrong? Daniel ended the call. Emily's school called. Is she hurt? No. He took a breath. They found something in her school records that doesn't make sense. Victoria frowned. What do you mean? Daniel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's face suddenly became serious. What did they find? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, they found a document from 8 years ago. Victoria looked confused. What document? Daniel's voice dropped. A document that says Emily's mother signed something before she disappeared. The room went silent. Victoria stared at him. Disappeared? Daniel nodded. My daughter's mother left when Emily was very young. Eleanor looked shocked. What did the document say? Daniel looked at his phone. It says she transferred legal responsibility for Emily to someone else. Victoria frowned. Who? Daniel looked up. His face had gone pale. That's the problem. He swallowed. The name on the document is Eleanor Sterling. Everyone turned toward Eleanor. Victoria stared at her mother. Mother? Eleanor didn't move. For the first time that morning, the confident founder of Sterling and Vale looked completely stunned. Daniel slowly stepped backward. I came here today because I thought this was a business meeting. He looked at Eleanor. But apparently it isn't. Victoria stared between them. Her mother said nothing. And Daniel suddenly realized that the biggest mystery in his life might have been connected to the Sterling family all along. The handshake he thought was the most awkward moment of his morning was about to become the least important thing that happened that day, because Daniel had just discovered a name he never expected to see in his daughter's past, Eleanor Sterling. And Eleanor looked like she had just discovered it for the first time, too. Daniel stood completely still. The conference room had suddenly become silent. Victoria looked at her mother. Mother, what does this mean? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the document in Daniel's hand. Finally, she spoke. I have never seen that document before. Daniel frowned. But your name is on it. I know. Then how can you say you don't know about it? Eleanor looked at him. Because 8 years ago, I was not involved in anyone's private family arrangements. Daniel shook his head. This isn't just some random document. I understand. Victoria stepped between them. Daniel, where did the school get it? The school said it was part of an old registration file. He looked at his phone again. They found it while updating Emily's records. Victoria looked at Eleanor. Could someone have used your name? Eleanor's expression became serious. Possibly. Daniel immediately asked, why would anyone do that? Nobody had an answer. Eleanor walked toward the table. Let me see the document. Daniel hesitated. Then he handed it over. Eleanor read it carefully. Her expression changed. This signature. Victoria moved closer. What? Eleanor pointed at the bottom. This isn't my signature. Daniel stared at her. Are you sure? I would know my own signature. Victoria looked at the document. So someone forged it. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Daniel's jaw tightened. Why? Eleanor looked at him. That's the question we need to answer. Daniel checked the time. I still need to get to the school. Victoria immediately stood. I'll come with you. Daniel looked surprised. You don't have to. I know. She picked up her handbag. I'm coming anyway. Richard watched them leave. His expression was unreadable. Eleanor noticed. Richard. He stopped. Yes. Don't touch anything on that table. Richard frowned. Why? Because until we know who created that document, nobody in this company should be trusted. Richard looked offended. Are you suggesting someone here forged it? Eleanor's eyes narrowed. I'm suggesting that we don't make assumptions. Daniel and Victoria left the conference room. They entered the private elevator. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Victoria broke the silence. I'm sorry. Daniel looked at her. For what? For this. You didn't create the document. No. She looked at him. But I judged you this morning. Daniel smiled slightly. You did. Victoria winced. You don't have to remind me. You asked. She almost laughed. Despite everything happening, Daniel's calm personality was strangely reassuring. The elevator reached the lobby. They walked outside into the bright afternoon. A company car was waiting. Victoria opened the rear door. Daniel stopped. I can drive. Victoria looked at him. You're taking me in your car? Yes. Why? Because you're my boss. She smiled. That sounded like a terrible reason. Daniel opened the driver's door. Get in. Victoria laughed. Fine. They drove toward Emily's school. The London streets were busy. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel. Victoria sat quietly beside him. After several minutes, she asked, Did Emily's mother really disappear? Daniel's expression became serious. She left when Emily was 2. Do you know where she went? No. Did she ever contact you? Once. Victoria turned toward him. When? 6 years ago. What did she say? Daniel looked ahead. She said she wasn't coming back. Victoria didn't know what to say. Daniel continued. I stopped asking questions after that. Why? Because Emily deserves stability. Victoria looked down. You raise her alone? Yes. That must have been difficult. It was. Daniel smiled. But she made it worth it. They arrived at the school. Daniel parked. They entered the reception area. A staff member greeted them. Mr. Carter? Yes. I'm Mrs. Thompson, the head administrator. Daniel nodded. This is Ms. Sterling. Mrs. Thompson looked surprised. Victoria Sterling? Victoria smiled politely. Yes. The administrator immediately became nervous. Daniel noticed. Please don't worry. We're just here about Emily. Mrs. Thompson nodded. Of course. She led them into a private office. A folder sat on the desk. Daniel recognized it immediately. That's it. Mrs. Thompson opened the folder. The document was discovered this morning. She handed it to Daniel. He looked at the page. It was an old legal form. At the bottom was Eleanor Sterling's name. But something else caught his attention. A second name. Daniel's eyes widened. Who's this? Mrs. Thompson looked at the document. I'm not sure. Victoria leaned closer. The name was James Whitmore. Daniel stared at it. Who is James Whitmore? Mrs. Thompson shook her head. We don't know. Victoria looked at Daniel. Does that name mean anything to you? Daniel shook his head. No. Mrs. Thompson pointed to another line. There's also an address. Daniel read it. His expression changed. Victoria noticed. What? Daniel pointed at the address. I know this place. Where is it? My daughter's mother used to work there. Victoria looked shocked. Are you saying Emily's mother may have been connected to this? Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe. The administrator looked uncomfortable. There's one more thing. Daniel looked at her. What? We received an email this morning. From whom? Mrs. Thompson turned the computer toward them. Daniel read the message. His face went pale. The email contained only one sentence. Stop asking questions about Emily Carter. Victoria immediately looked at him. Who sent it? Mrs. Thompson shook her head. The sender used a private address. Daniel stood. Can you trace it? We've already contacted our IT department. Victoria's expression hardened. Send a message to my office. Mrs. Thompson nodded. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Someone knew about Emily. Someone knew about the old document. And someone didn't want Daniel asking questions. Victoria looked at him. We're going back to Sterling and Vale. Daniel nodded. On the drive back, Daniel remained unusually quiet. Victoria noticed. Are you worried? Yes. About Emily? Always. Victoria looked at him. You don't have to handle this alone. Daniel smiled sadly. I've been handling things alone for 8 years. Maybe you shouldn't have to. Daniel looked at her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his phone rang. It was Eleanor. Daniel answered. Hello. Eleanor's voice was urgent. Daniel, come back to the office immediately. Why? I found something. What? I found the original company records from 8 years ago. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. What do they say? Eleanor hesitated. James Whitmore worked for Sterling and Vale. Daniel's eyes widened. What position? Eleanor's voice became quiet. He was head of corporate security. Victoria looked at Daniel. Security? Daniel nodded. Eleanor continued. And he left the company shortly after your daughter's mother disappeared. Daniel felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. Why? I don't know. Then find out. I am. The call ended. Daniel looked at Victoria. Your mother knows more than she's saying. Victoria nodded. I think you're right. They returned to Sterling and Vale. Eleanor was waiting in her private office. Several old files were spread across her desk. Daniel entered. Victoria followed. Eleanor pointed toward a chair. Sit. Daniel didn't sit. What happened? Eleanor took a breath. 8 years ago, James Whitmore was responsible for protecting confidential company information. Daniel frowned. What does that have to do with Emily? Eleanor looked at him. I don't know. Then why was his name on the document? I don't know. Daniel became frustrated. I need answers. I know. Eleanor opened another file. James resigned suddenly. Why? He claimed there was a conflict involving a senior executive. Victoria frowned. Who? Eleanor looked at her. Your father. Victoria froze. My father? Eleanor nodded. Your father was CEO at the time. Daniel stared at Eleanor. What was the conflict? Eleanor shook her head. James never told me. Victoria picked up the file. Then why keep it? Because I suspected he was protecting someone. Daniel asked, Who? Eleanor looked directly at him. I thought it was your daughter's mother. Daniel's heart stopped. Why? Eleanor's expression softened. Because she came to me once. Daniel stepped forward. When? 8 years ago. What did she want? Eleanor looked down. She asked me to protect her child. Daniel's face went pale. Emily? Eleanor nodded. She told me something terrible had happened. Daniel's voice became almost a whisper. What? Before Eleanor could answer, the office door opened. Richard Hale walked inside. Mrs. Sterling, I need to speak with you. Eleanor immediately closed the file. Daniel noticed. Victoria noticed too. Richard looked at Daniel. Why is he here? Victoria answered. Because this concerns his daughter. Richard's expression changed for just a second. Daniel saw it. It was only a tiny reaction, but he saw it. Richard recovered quickly. I don't understand. Daniel stared at him. Do you know James Whitmore? Richard went silent. Victoria looked at him. Richard? He swallowed. Yes. Daniel stepped closer. How? Richard looked uncomfortable. We worked together years ago. Why didn't you say that earlier? I wasn't asked. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Did you know Emily's mother? Richard didn't answer. Eleanor stood. Richard. He looked at her. Where were you the day James Whitmore resigned? Richard's face changed. I don't remember. Eleanor stared at him. You don't? No. Victoria looked at her mother. Mother, what's going on? Eleanor's voice was cold. Someone has been lying to this family for 8 years. Daniel looked at Richard. And I think we just found the first person who knows why. Richard suddenly turned toward the door. Victoria moved in front of him. Where are you going? I have work. Not anymore. Richard stared at her. You can't fire me over an old accusation. Victoria's expression hardened. I'm not firing you. She stepped closer. I'm asking you one question. Richard remained silent. Victoria asked, Who is James Whitmore protecting? Richard looked at Daniel, then at Eleanor. Finally, he whispered, You have no idea what you're looking for. Daniel stepped forward. Then tell me. Richard shook his head. I can't. Why? Richard looked toward the window. Because if I tell you, Emily won't be safe. Daniel's face went completely still. Victoria's expression changed. Eleanor whispered, What did you say? Richard backed away. I shouldn't have said that. Daniel grabbed the edge of the desk. What do you know about my daughter? Richard didn't answer. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face turned white. Daniel noticed. Who was calling? Richard didn't respond. The phone rang again. Eleanor walked toward him. Answer it. Richard shook his head. No. Victoria demanded. Answer it. Richard finally picked up. Hello? Nobody could hear the voice on the other end. But Richard's expression told him enough. He listened for several seconds. Then he said, I understand. He ended the call. Daniel stared at him. What did they say? Richard looked at Daniel. Your daughter isn't the person they're looking for. Daniel frowned. Then who are they looking for? Richard's eyes moved toward Eleanor. They're looking for the woman who signed the original document. Eleanor froze. Daniel looked confused. But you said the signature was forged. Eleanor slowly shook her head. I said the signature on this copy was forged. Richard whispered. The original wasn't. Everyone became silent. Daniel looked at Eleanor. Victoria looked at her mother. And Eleanor finally understood why someone had been trying to keep the past buried. The document wasn't simply about Emily. It was about a decision Eleanor herself had made 8 years ago. A decision she had completely forgotten. And when Daniel discovered the truth, he would realize that the woman he had trusted to explain everything might actually be the key to the entire mystery. The office became completely silent. Daniel stared at Eleanor. "You signed the original?" Eleanor looked shaken. "I don't remember signing anything involving Emily." Richard lowered his eyes. "Because you weren't told what you were signing." Victoria stepped closer. "What does that mean?" Richard looked at Eleanor. 8 years ago, your father asked Eleanor to sign a temporary guardianship document." Eleanor frowned. "My husband?" Richard nodded. "He told her it was connected to an employee protection matter." Daniel's expression hardened. "Emily's mother?" Richard nodded slowly. "Yes." Daniel took a breath. "Why would my daughter's mother need protection?" Richard looked at him. "Because she had discovered something." "What?" Richard hesitated. "Financial fraud." Victoria's eyes widened. "Inside Sterling and Vale?" Richard nodded. "Someone had been moving company money through false suppliers." Daniel looked at the documents on the desk. "How much?" "Millions." Eleanor looked shocked. "Why wasn't I told?" Richard looked at her. "Because the person responsible was close to your husband." Victoria immediately asked, "Who?" Richard looked at Daniel, then at Eleanor. Finally, he said, "James Whitmore." Daniel frowned. "But James was head of security." "Exactly." Victoria stared at him. "Are you saying he stole from the company?" Richard shook his head. "No." He took a breath. "James discovered the fraud." Daniel understood. "He tried to expose it." Richard nodded. "But someone threatened him." "Who?" Richard looked toward the door. "Your father?" Victoria froze. "My father?" Richard nodded. "He didn't create the fraud." "Then why would he threaten James?" "Because James had discovered something else." Daniel stepped closer. "What?" Richard looked at Eleanor. "He discovered that someone inside the company was using confidential information to manipulate major partnerships." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Carter and Bell?" Richard nodded. "Yes." Victoria's face became pale. "So the partnership was targeted 8 years ago." "Yes." Daniel thought about the 23 inconsistencies he had found that morning. Someone had been trying to interfere with Carter and Bell again. But why? Richard continued. "Emily's mother found evidence." Daniel asked, "What did she do?" "She went to Eleanor." Eleanor closed her eyes. Suddenly, memories began returning. A young woman, a frightened expression, a child, a folder of documents. Eleanor whispered, "She came to my house." Daniel stared at her. "What did she tell you?" Eleanor looked at him. "She said she was afraid someone would hurt you." Daniel's face changed. "Me?" Eleanor nodded. "She believed you were being watched because of your work with Carter and Bell." Daniel shook his head. "But I wasn't important enough." Eleanor looked at him. "You were more important than you knew." Daniel remembered the years he had spent working quietly. He had always thought he was simply doing his job, but perhaps someone had noticed his ability long before he realized it himself. Victoria asked, "What happened to Emily's mother?" Eleanor's eyes filled with sadness. "She asked me to protect Emily." Daniel's voice became tense. "And then I arranged temporary guardianship." Daniel stared at her. "You signed it?" "Yes." "Then why don't you remember?" Eleanor looked at Richard. Richard answered, "Because the original document was later replaced." Daniel understood. "The forged copy." Richard nodded. Someone wanted Daniel to believe Eleanor had permanently taken control of Emily's future. Victoria shook her head. "But why?" Richard looked at her. "To make Daniel angry enough to investigate." Daniel frowned. "What?" Richard continued. "The people behind the fraud wanted Daniel to discover the truth." "That makes no sense." "It does if they wanted to use him." Daniel stared at him. "Use me for what?" Richard lowered his voice. "To expose the remaining people involved." Victoria looked confused. "Why would they need Daniel?" Richard answered, "Because Carter and Bell trust him." Silence returned. Daniel finally understood. Someone had deliberately positioned him between Sterling and Vale and Carter and Bell. His reputation was being used as leverage. But there was still one question. Who was behind it? Richard looked toward the window. I don't know everyone. Who do you know? Richard hesitated. One person. Daniel stepped forward. Who? Richard looked at Victoria. Your father's former business advisor. Victoria's face changed. Andrew Blake. Richard nodded. Daniel recognized the name. Andrew Blake was a famous British businessman. He had advised Sterling and Vale for years. He was considered one of the smartest people in the industry, and he was also one of the people currently negotiating the Carter and Bell partnership. Victoria whispered, He's still involved? Richard nodded. Very much. Eleanor immediately picked up her phone. I'll call the board. Victoria stopped her. No. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Victoria's voice was firm. If Andrew knows we discover this, he'll disappear. Daniel looked at Victoria. So what do we do? Victoria looked at him. We let him think nothing has changed. Daniel smiled slightly. You want to set a trap? Victoria nodded. Exactly. Eleanor looked between them. Be careful. Daniel nodded. I will. Victoria turned toward Richard. You'll help us? Richard looked exhausted. Yes. Daniel asked, Why? Richard looked down. Because I should have spoken 8 years ago. Daniel said nothing. The plan began immediately. Victoria scheduled a new meeting with Andrew Blake. The meeting would take place in the afternoon. Daniel would attend. Eleanor would remain nearby. Richard would provide the old financial records. But the most important part of the plan was simple. They would tell Andrew that Daniel had rejected the Carter and Bell offer. They would make him believe Daniel was leaving the partnership. If Andrew had been using Daniel's position, he might react. At 2 o'clock, Andrew arrived. He entered the conference room confidently. He was in his early 60s. Silver hair, perfect suit, calm smile. Victoria. Andrew. He looked around. Where is everyone? Victoria smiled. Only the people who need to be here. Andrew sat. Daniel entered a moment later. Andrew looked at him. Mr. Carter. Daniel nodded. Mr. Blake. Andrew smiled. I've heard good things about your work. Daniel sat. Thank you. Andrew opened his folder. I understand you reconsidered your involvement with Carter and Bell. Daniel looked at Victoria, then back at Andrew. Yes. Andrew's expression changed slightly. You're leaving? Possibly. Andrew leaned forward. That's unfortunate. Daniel watched him carefully. Why? Because Carter and Bell trust you. Daniel nodded. Apparently. Andrew smiled. You should think carefully before making decisions. Daniel replied, I always do. Victoria remained silent. Andrew looked at her. Surely the company doesn't want to lose him. Victoria smiled. We'll survive. Andrew laughed. Of course. Then Daniel said something unexpected. I've decided to sell my interest in the partnership. Andrew froze. Only for a second, but Victoria noticed. So did Eleanor, watching through the glass partition. Andrew quickly recovered. Your interest? Daniel nodded. I was offered shares. Andrew's face became serious. And you're selling? Yes. To whom? Daniel smiled. Someone who understands the value. Andrew leaned back. That's a mistake. Daniel watched him. Why? Andrew's voice became colder. Because you don't understand what you're holding. Victoria finally spoke. Interesting. Andrew looked at her. What? You just said Daniel doesn't understand what he's holding. Andrew paused. Victoria leaned forward. How would you know what he was offered? The room became silent. Andrew's expression changed. Daniel slowly stood. You weren't supposed to know about the offer. Andrew stared at him. Victoria smiled. Exactly. Andrew looked toward the door. Eleanor entered. Andrew immediately stood. Eleanor. She looked directly at him. Andrew. His confidence disappeared. Eleanor placed an old file on the table. Do you recognize this? Andrew stared at it. No. Eleanor opened the file. James Whitmore's records. Andrew said nothing. Eleanor continued. His resignation. Still nothing. His financial investigation. Andrew's face tightened. And the original guardianship document. Andrew suddenly looked at Daniel. Daniel realized something. Andrew wasn't surprised by the document. He was afraid of it. Daniel said quietly, "You knew." Andrew didn't answer. Victoria stepped forward. "You knew about Emily's mother." Andrew looked at her. "Your father was trying to protect this company." Victoria shook her head. "Don't blame my father." Andrew's expression hardened. "You don't understand what happened." Daniel interrupted. "Then explain it." Andrew looked at him. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he finally said, "Your daughter's mother wasn't running from you." Daniel's face changed. "What?" "She was running from people inside the company." "Where did she go?" Andrew shook his head. "I don't know." Daniel stepped closer. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect you to believe anything." Andrew looked exhausted. "But I know one thing." "What?" "She left because she believed someone was going to use Emily to control you." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Victoria looked at Eleanor. Eleanor slowly nodded. That explained everything. The forged document, the threats, the old records, the Carter and Bell partnership. It had all been connected. But Andrew wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase. "I brought something." He placed a small envelope on the table. Daniel stared at it. "What's that?" "Something your daughter's mother left behind." Daniel's hands trembled slightly. He opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Emily's mother was standing beside a little girl, a much younger Emily. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. Daniel read it. His eyes filled with tears. Victoria quietly stepped beside him. Daniel whispered. She knew. Victoria asked, "What?" Daniel turned the photograph around. There was one sentence written on the back. "Daniel, if you ever learn the truth, please forgive me." Daniel closed his eyes. For 8 years, he had believed Emily's mother simply abandoned them. Now he understood. She had been trying to protect them. Andrew looked at Daniel. "There's one more thing." Daniel opened his eyes. "What?" Andrew pointed toward the photograph. "She wasn't alone when she left." Daniel froze. "Who was with her?" Andrew looked at Eleanor, then at Victoria. Finally, he said, "Someone from the Sterling family." Victoria's face went pale. Daniel stared at her. "Who?" Andrew didn't answer. Eleanor slowly sat down, and then she whispered a name nobody expected. Victoria's father. Victoria froze. "My father?" Eleanor nodded. "He was the last person to see Emily's mother before she disappeared." Daniel stood completely still. The room felt smaller. Everything Daniel believed about the past had just changed. His daughter's mother hadn't simply walked away. She had been involved in a secret that reached the highest level of Sterling and Vale. And Victoria's late father might have been the last person who knew the full truth. Daniel looked at Victoria. She looked devastated. "I didn't know." Daniel nodded. "I believe you." Victoria looked at him. "Why?" "Because you looked just as shocked as I did." For the first time, Victoria reached for his hand. Not because he was a valuable partner. Not because her mother demanded respect. But because she understood what Daniel was facing. He had spent 8 years raising his daughter, while carrying the pain of believing someone had chosen to leave them. Now, he finally had a reason. And perhaps, somewhere in London, there was still someone who knew exactly where Emily's mother had gone. Daniel looked at the photograph again. Then he made a decision. "I'm going to find her." Victoria nodded. "I'll help." Eleanor stood. "So will I." Daniel looked at both women. "Why?" Eleanor answered first. "Because I owe you the truth." Victoria looked at him. "And because you deserve to know what happened to your family." Daniel folded the photograph carefully. Then he smiled faintly. "All right." Outside, the afternoon sun continued shining over London. The business world carried on. Cars moved through the streets. Employees returned to their offices. Nobody outside the room knew that one of Britain's most powerful companies had just uncovered an 8-year-old secret. Nobody knew that a single father had become the center of a corporate mystery. And nobody knew that the man once treated as an ordinary employee was actually the key to protecting the company's most important partnership. But Daniel finally understood something. The handshake Victoria had refused that morning had not been the beginning of his story. It had been the moment their lives crossed. And by the end of that day, Victoria Sterling no longer saw Daniel as an ordinary employee. She saw him as the man who had protected her company without asking for recognition, the father who had sacrificed wealth for his daughter, and the man whose family story was connected to hers in a way neither of them could have imagined. The biggest twist, however, was still waiting, because the next morning, Daniel would receive a letter. It would contain no threats, no demands, only a return address. And that address would prove one thing. Emily's mother had been alive all along.